the Imaginary Republic, Dirty Ear Forum, Surface Tensions, and Beyond Music Sound Festival. In 1995, he founded Errant Bodies Press, an independent publishing project supporting work in sound art and studies, performance and poetics, artistic research, and contemporary political thought. His publications include Dreamtime X, Acoustic Justice, The Other Citizen, Sonic Agency, Lexicon of the Mouth, Acoustic Territories, and Background Noise. Brendan.
Hello. Thank you very much, Mayan, for the introduction and for the very nice invitation to join you and to contribute to the public program. So thanks for having me. I'm going to kind of talk through some current research, some current thoughts. I'll speak for, roughly 30 to 40 minutes. And then, of course, I'm very open to have a discussion after. If there's any questions or thoughts you'd like to share. So feel free to collect those along the way. Okay. So following the general theme and topics of the Academy and the public program, I was thinking for this evening to bring attention to what I'm thinking about as an acoustic knowledge. So thinking acoustic knowledge, and the ways in which we might appreciate how that contributes to forms of human flourishing, right? So how acoustic knowledge contributes to ways of being together. Part of this includes reflecting upon the urgencies around hearing and being heard. What does it mean to hear and be heard? As well as generally acts of sounding. I'm generally moved to consider sound itself as a type of energetic punctuation, as what carries and manifests what we could think of as the vibrancy of the living. In short, sound as animation, and which can lend to what Robin Wall Kimmerer terms a grammar of animacy, a grammar of animacy. So we can further this by following sound as what also connects to the missing, to the lost, the absent, the dead, drawing this out by way of an auditory imagination, where the seemingly inanimate may speak. Through the reverberations of memory, the silent traces of a past, the sacred stories whose voices resound in the heart. All of this, which in a way connects and brings to life the missing. The ways in which sound may be appreciated to traffic across the living and the dead, the animate and the inanimate, the visible and the less than visible. All of this warrants a deeper thinking, a feeling thinking, to follow sound as a poetic force, a bioacoustic, and how it contributes to supporting lives and communities, bodies and persons, to materially, spiritually, emotionally pick up the potentiality of life itself. While sound may be deployed in various systems of abuse as part of structures of violence and harm, which is something to consider, I'm more interested to focus on sound as affirmation, as socially transformative, as what provides the ground for a culture of enlivenment. Does not the balance between audibility and inaudibility, between the heard and unheard, contribute to the degree to which life is livable, or how livability is tied to listenability? In what ways do we survive and flourish by way of feeling heard, acknowledged, connected? To be positioned outside the lines demarcating listenability is to be disenfranchised, disempowered, dejected. This may not only be a question of simply raising the volume on one's needs, rather it may be to strive for tactics by which to shift the normative lines defining the arena of listenability, to retune the hearing range of certain social political worlds. So I want to reflect further on the notion of the inaudible and the unheard as coordinates giving shape to a livable life. To do so, I'll bring into play the notion of negative listening as a method, as a tactic. This may allow for giving attention to that which is positioned outside the arena of listenability, and which also stakes out a listening positionality, one attuned ethically or poetically to the realities of absence. So I'll come back to negative listening. We may start, first of all, thinking around the inaudible in relation to the voice. From voices that go unheard within particular social or political systems, something we know very well, to those voices that also remain buried within ourselves. From inner to outer voices, from the micro to the macro political, and their influence onto the dynamics of a vocal economy. In what ways does inaudibility condition voice and experiences of listening? If the inaudible equates with the unheard, are there listening practices to be developed by which to approach the unheard, to shift or recalibrate the dynamics of a given vocal economy? And is inaudibility necessarily something to work against in terms of supporting a move towards being heard? In fact, is it possible to partner with the inaudible on its own terms? We can develop this line of questioning by thinking further about the inaudible, firstly as it resides within, as those silences one comes to carry in the body and the inner worlds of memory, emotional life, private thought, and which listening affords, we could say, a special type of access. Here, we can appreciate how listening to the body, as if listening reaches in, is often to navigate the inaudible layers of past experience. Listening addresses inner life, and in doing so, it evokes the body as an inner acoustic. To listen inwardly is to sound out the chambers of life experience, to tap the inner acoustic so as to attune to all that comes reverberating back, maybe appearing as an audible inaudible or an unsound sound. Through such listening acts, the inaudible might be cast as the unconscious itself, of all that rests in the body and which may come to awaken us to the transformative power of listening itself, as what keeps close to the body, full of the chamber music, as Clarice Lispector describes inner life, giving way to forms of care. Following inner listening as a care of the self, as what attends to the silent noise within that mysterious chamber music, we may further think the inaudible on a social political level, in which communities or marginalized individuals go unheard. Struggles over political representation and social recognition are greatly influenced by the degree to which one feels heard across particular contexts. Here, we might consider something along the lines of an acoustics of representation, in terms of a distribution of what or who is heard. To engage the unheard can be to intervene within the acoustics of representation, to shift the defining tonalities, structures, and arrangements, shaping listenability, and what or who goes heard or unheard. Can we think of listening as what may make such an intervention? From listening as what evokes an inner acoustic, so as to assist in attending to the unheard within, and that aids in processes of repair, to listening as what may retune the acoustics of representation by giving room to the marginalized. We may think listening as an acoustic practice in terms of setting the conditions for reworking the borders of the sensible. These perspectives figure the unheard and the inaudible as social, political questions, as questions of the body, as well as that of voice, as questions of representation and recognition, and that suggest practices, methodologies, discourses. We want to follow the inaudible and the unheard to track perspectives and practices that deepen a sense for the politics as well as the poetics of listenability, to unpack the embodied, affective dimensions and experiences to the inaudible, as well as to research the social dimensions and what it might mean to intervene onto the arena of listenability. So I want to stay a little bit first with the dynamics of inner listening, to think about more deeply that inner acoustic that becomes a chamber, a carrier, a vessel of inner life. Again, how listening allows a certain kind of access to that which is within. How can we think this further? It might be said inner listening is a first listening, as it arises in tandem with the emergence of the self. We can follow this a little bit by taking a tour through some of the thinking of Jacques Lacan and his psychoanalytic theories. So if you follow me for a moment, I'll take you through some of Lacan's fundamental ideas, right? Primarily to think a little bit about how he understands the unconscious itself as being a form of organization of the self. Right? Lacan maps the question of subjectivity by way of the organization of the unconscious. He develops this through three terms: the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. The symbolic designates that order of language, the realm of the signifier, or what we can think of as the name. How we participate as social subjects within the symbolic order. I am my name, right? This is that moment of participation within the symbolic. Secondly, he moves us to what he calls the imaginary, which is the realm of representation, which maybe if any of you are an artist or involved in the arts, we know very well the realm of the imaginary in terms of the making of representation. And fundamentally how this relates to signification in terms of the images that circulate or are registered, the world of meanings, all the images that represent me. Finally, Lacan takes us to the real, which is understood as pre-symbolic, pre-linguistic. The real has no representation, no image. Therefore, it is opposed to the imaginary. It is in fact impossible to image. It has no name, the real as the unnameable. It is, in fact, impossible to image, to name, and even to hold. It resists the symbolic. It is outside of language. This is the real, or what we can think of as the really real. So we'll follow a little bit the really real for a moment. The three features of the unconscious can be elaborated by following Lacan's theory of the mirror stage, which describes the moment when a child, he terms generally under a year, is confronted with its own reflection. The scene Lacan describes is one where, as the mother or caretaker holds the child, they turn to face a mirror, pointing to show the child its own reflection. The child sees itself, and it sees the mother pointing, and it realizes in that moment it is separate. Suddenly, it sees itself as an individual, as a separate body, different and unique. This moment interrupts the primary unity of the subject. It brings the child into the world of the imaginary, as well as that of the symbolic, of language, identity, and meaning, and it evokes the real. Lacan accentuates this instant as a cut, as a separation that brings the child into the world of desire. Desire is set loose through separation, and it fixes itself onto other objects, onto even itself in that narcissistic moment of staring in the mirror. All I have is myself. Yeah. I must fill this emptiness with my own reflection. Right? This is the moment of the real. What is happening in this instant, this cut, is also the emergence of the real. The real relates us precisely to what we can no longer have. This pre-symbolic, pre-linguistic unity. The real always has a traumatic quality. It is experienced as rupture. And furthermore, the real is never representable. And yet, importantly, it shows itself nonetheless. This is what Lacan calls the thing. The thing. So let us stay with the thing. The thing can be thought as a remainder which falls or breaks off in that moment of identification. In this instant of seeing oneself, of realizing oneself as an I, there is an excess, something that is cast off. That something is the thing. It is as if I lose a part of myself, which remains enigmatic, unknowable, but all too close, leading to recognize that there is always something not me about me. This not me is the thing. Importantly, the thing is highlighted as an empty center. Lacan calls it an empty center, a nothing at the center of subjectivity. At the same time, this empty center, this not me, emerges as the first outside, something foreign within myself. The thing in this way is always uncanny. Finally, the thing comes to manifest the real and take shape through fantasy. Following the cut and the entry into language, we turn back, seeing the real as what needs to be symbolized or recovered. While there is no returning, no going back, the real spins into fantasy. It figures itself as what Lacan calls an impossible object. The thing. The thing is quite clearly an art object. And we can come back to that if you like. I share all this to think more about the unheard and the inaudible as residing within ourselves. To listen to oneself might be to approach the thing as an impossible sound. It might be what calls to us, what speaks, but has no voice, as an inner voice, a fleeting voice of memory or that of dreams. The thing is the primary unheard, which sits at the center of the audible, and to which listening is turned in the care of the self. It is by way of the empty center, which is already an acoustic image, if we think the empty center as an acoustic space of the real, that we may begin to recognize inner life as an acoustic question, an empty center that resounds with the irretrievable past, with a reverberation of memories, with the silence of the not quite nameable, and all the inner voices through which one works at a care of the self. The body speaks, and its voice is that of a foreigner to which I am bound. Whether in speaking to myself as a strange kind of partner, or in the genetic code that figures the body within an extended line of evolution and collective memory, or by way of the spiritual resonances that pass through the body, connecting to the sacred stories, these things to which one is held and which offers guidance through an inner listening, a first listening. So we've kind of been touring through Lacan and the thing, exploring the enigmatic nature of the real, in a way to also think further about the inaudible and the unheard, thinking of those things as central rather than as exceptional, right? Rather than as peripheral. We often think the unheard is that which exists on the periphery, trying to enter the center, when in fact the unheard and the inaudible is the center. This is something I think that starts to emerge through following notions of inner listening by way of the thing. Because the thing is never truly or finally heard. Rather, listening is called to navigate its strange messages, its dreaming, to attend to the empty center in ways that are never fully realized or fulfilled. Rather, one works at particular methodologies, from acts of meditation, confession, diary keeping, from musical rapture, prayer, and dance, to gardening, kitchen work, maybe even partying. Methodologies are found by which to attune to the body and all that it holds, to stay sensitive to those things that call for greater attention and that ground us in the possibility of connection, of staying connected to the roots, the undergrowth of embodied life, the story of the body. So I want to expand upon listening as a way of approaching the inaudible and the unheard, moving from the inner world to that of the outer, and the movements of social and political life, especially those realities marked by absence, emptiness, by political violence. The anthropologist Yael Navarro develops the concept of what she calls negative methodology as a way to contend with realities of disappearance and loss, of the missing. In particular, she seeks to address the remains of political violence, the fragments, the ruins. We can ask, what happens when we are left with ruins? As she highlights acts of anthropological research. Her field is anthropology. Acts of anthropological research often proceed by trying to put the pieces back together, to fill in the gaps, the silences left behind, in an attempt to solve the problem, often through gestures of reconstruction, of unfinished or destroyed history. In contrast to this rather positivist method, she calls us into a negative methodology. Negative methodology is a counter methodology, one that does not aim to give voice to the voiceless, but rather holds the tension between history and truth, between the ruins and the need to know. Negative methodology wields a refusal to complete the narrative, to capture history within a totalizing representation. Instead, it keeps within the gaps, asking us to attend by way of the emptiness, the shards, a research approach that stays in the fissures, rifts, enigmas, and hollows of knowledge production. Negative methodology is positioned as generative of sensing, researching, attending to the aftermath of political violence in ways that specifically allow for not knowing, especially when sites or locations may resist the researcher's desire to find out, to make present that which is terribly absent. Those jagged realities in which history may never be recovered. Following Navarro, we might think the inaudible and the unheard to consider a form of listening that does not necessarily search for answers, to finally hear the voiceless or the missing, but rather stays in the gaps, to inhabit the complex acoustics of the unheard. We might begin to think a form of negative listening as a listening that can approach the inaudible and the unheard on their own terms, that delays listening as what tries to hear, that may, in a way, fill in the gaps of the broken. Instead, negative listening keeps one close to a nuanced form of listening, especially in terms of recognizing how the inaudible may speak in the negative. And negative listening is listening in broken times, to listen by way of the ruins, the remains, and what they withhold. A listening that is adept at relating to absence, to attuning to traces left behind, and which may figure itself in the fissures, the silences, and the voids. Negative listening moves amongst the fragments to pick up stray frequencies, those which hover under or above hearing range, the vibrational murmurs or hummings that carry the dead. These are ways of listening that may gather from the pieces a range of echoes carried over from those gone missing. Negative listening is shadowy work, especially when confronting erasures and a lack of documents, for example, and through which one may come to witness that which cannot be witnessed. These are the empty centers that populate social and political worlds, that shape by way of their enigmatic present absence, their inaudible reverberations, the articulations of knowledge. So moving from the inner listening that emerges by way of the empty center of subjectivity to the negative listening that may attend to the terrible silences of social and political worlds, we are mapping an acoustic knowledge, a poetic knowledge. This is a knowledge that may contribute to sounding a livable life, that impacts onto the norms of intelligibility, shaping who or what is heard, and also in what ways listening may extend itself, to give way to practices that may help us tell different stories. To conclude this flow of thoughts, I want to bring into focus, finally, the question of the public secret. In his book, Defacement, Michael Taussig highlights how a given social political order is held in place through its ability to mask its own power. Power does not declare itself as such. Rather, it insinuates itself through a range of public secrets. The public secret is precisely what is known but cannot be articulated or spoken out. It leads to a rather uncanny dialectic between concealment and revelation. In short, we come to know what not to know. Importantly for Taussig, the public secret incites forms of transgression, to unmask power for what it conceals. The public secret already anticipates this. Power anticipates its own unmasking, and it does much to continually remystify itself. This leads Taussig to the idea of defacement. To deface something is to write over it, to vandalize a given monument, for example. It is to scratch out the face. It is not necessarily to remove completely. Rather, defacing disrespects a given structure of power, a given narrative or representation, and it is enacted for all to see. For Taussig, defacement performs a creative negation that does not necessarily overcome the public secret, but rather reinforces it as sacred, as an empty center, a thing to which one is mysteriously held. Thinking further about creative negation and what it means to deface, we might think how this resonates also with questions of listening. So I want to end by just sharing two figures or two ideas. One figure being that of the whistleblower or the eavesdropper, as the one who overhears. The whistleblower, the eavesdropper, captures information that was not intended to be heard, and which contributes to unmasking truth, revealing the secret, especially in terms of working at power and its distribution, and the strange grip of public secrets. That is, what we know, what not to know. We might think the eavesdropper and the whistleblower along the lines of a third listener, the one to the side of any given conversation, and that traffics in the heard and the unheard, and the complex tensions held by the public secret. These are figures who also do the shadowy work of defacing the signs of power so as to unleash an impossible form of knowing, to confront what we can think of as the really real. Secondly, we can think about the witness. The witness we may think as a figure also of the negative, of working with and against the public secret. The witness may see that which should not be seen. While witnessing, we may confront surrounding events. But witnessing also holds a space for acknowledging the harm of others. The witness, as listener, inserts a gap for the outspoken to resound ever more fully, allowing for truth to be told. As Dory Laub suggests, the witness acts as a guardian to the process of testimony, where memory and speech are always negotiating the shadows of truth. Both these figures, the whistleblower, eavesdropper, and the witness, traffic in the dynamics of the heard and the unheard, working through and against the violence of public secrets as empty centers located within the collective body of social political life, and that carry all that we cannot hear, but which speaks nonetheless. From listening inwardly in gestures that contend with the impossible sound of the thing, that search for a care of the self, by way of the empty center with all its silent reverberations, to how it is we may approach the ruins, the remains of broken histories, to be witness to the public secrets shaping tensions around truth. I've been pursuing practices of inner listening, of negative listening, of a third listening. These are poetic moves that stay with the unheard, that give recognition precisely to the unrecognizable. To sound a livable life may take guidance from the unheard, finding roots by way of the uncanny figures at the center of oneself and of society. It is along these lines that we may start to map a poetics of listening as a listening that stays with the complex gray zones of our contemporary moment. These are the gray zones that extend across sense and nonsense, me and not me, self and other, and which require an ongoing invention of languages, as well as the courage to listen ever more fully. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thanks very much. We are, if anyone has a comment or we want to...
Does anybody have a question or a comment?
Or you're very welcome to share anything, or...
I was hoping to have a little bit more time before asking this question because it's somewhat unformulated, and I'm curious about when you're talking about the really real and how, like, through what I've understood of what you were saying, it seems to be something that is like when we're jolted away from our desires or when we realize what we can't achieve, or it's like something that's taken away, and when you're talking about the really real, are you talking about just that, or like in thinking about like the real world, like the built environment that we see around us, and how it can't be represented, but then as artists, I feel like we're always trying to represent it. And I'm curious about if the really real, or the real, if you're talking about like what I see right now. I guess I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that. That makes sense. It was, sorry, unformulated.
No, that's okay. I mean, it's unformulated in a way because, as Lacan would say, the really real is also that which is constantly eludes us. That in a way you can't really, once you approach it, it disappears, right? It's always evading capture. This is primarily the real, the empty center, the thing that is an enigma that we can't really know fully. So it's no wonder that we try and we trace around it and we try to approach it in many different ways. And I think one of them is very much art. And so, but do we ever arrive there? No. And that is precisely how Lacan understands that the real is what also drives us. It is at the center, and it is the basis for what drives us towards representations, towards attempts at representing the thing. So the really real is just a play on accentuating that, because there is something special about the way that Lacan uses the term the real. You know, I think as your question was pointing at, you know, we tend to think that this is the real, you know, that which we see, the reality around us. And I think he intentionally uses that, right, to say that the real is actually something else entirely. This is the sort of world of material things and of representation and of language, the symbolic, the things that we produce. But behind all that, what's really driving reality is this unapproachable, mysterious nothingness. Yeah, the no thing. And I guess I was very much, have been following that as a way of approaching ideas about the unheard and the inaudible. You know, if we think again so often about challenges within our social and political worlds, within our own personal experiences, always, you know, creating spaces, pursuing opportunities for being heard, right? We sort of struggle towards gaining agency, becoming visible, all of these things that in a way drive the mechanisms of recognition and social participation, which are all very important. And somehow along the way, I started to question, well, what do we miss if we only hear the unheard as something that needs to be heard, right? Can we, in fact, hear the unheard on its own terms? What does the unheard actually tell us? And in following that question, it's also about giving agency to the unheard, right? That it's not, it may be, in fact, that the unheard is something that only I cannot hear, right? But others are perfectly well hearing it. So the way that we place onto the unheard a certain expectation, a certain characterizing it as being unfulfilled, right? As being something that needs rescuing. So just wanting to open up that more counterintuitive perspective. Again, how do we, in fact, learn from the unheard? Yeah.
Hi, Gia. Thanks so much for your very touching and thoughtful lecture performance. I am wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about the relationship between the unheard and the other. Because as you, I mean, I used to be very invested in the concept of hospitality, you know, which is all about self-othering, self and other. And a lot of what you said really resonated in how I sort of tried to understand the position of the other, like in your language, I think, as the unheard.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I mean, I think for myself, maybe if I could speak as an author, and I also, really resonate with the question of hospitality, that in a way, in my own practice, I have also been thinking more about authorship as more like creating the conditions for others, right? So authoring in a way as a holding of space, a holding of a discourse, a holding of a vocabulary that is also very welcoming and very affirmative and very generative in terms of inviting imagination, inviting other perspectives, inviting dialogue. So it's at least in my mind, That's what I work towards. And I feel that, the language of listening is also very much about that. So I feel like I've tried to, or at least I have found myself feeling in the right place when the writing is shaped by listening, right? Understanding myself as a listening writer. I have found that this is the right direction, or at least in my own practice, feeling that what that does has been very rich and very enriching. I know that might be hard to really point at exactly how that's working, but I feel it more intuitively, and I feel that the thinking, listening as a language has been very useful. And again, that sort of challenges us. We tend to think listening as that moment of reception. And I've been thinking listening as authoring. So listening as a form of agency, as something that really enacts. And it does so in a way that, again, I think is very much about hospitality, or at least can be very much aimed in that direction. So these are some thoughts around your question. Yeah.
Hi. It's loud. Thank you, first of all. It was interesting conception to hear about this you call this counterintuitive to yourself, also to your former practices, as a suggestion of thought. I was wondering how you think with this suggestion as something that is with the possibility of movement, because when you think about this unvoiced as, or the thing, the real, as something that is unimaginary or untouchable, and to center that, I was wondering how within that, if there is is this a suggestion of something that is unmovable, because or in what circumstances is these things that are unheard or unrepresentative or unimaginary, do they have, or is it possible to create some kind of movement between them, or not necessarily by humans, but in general? What is that? And maybe it's the same answer for something which is within the self, but also within society, because you did this link between how we address ourselves as inner listening, but also how to address unheard things in our society. So I wonder if it's that is not accessible, or putting this inaccessible in the center, does it leave an option for mobility within that?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's important to bring in the question. I guess I follow the question of movement as a somatic issue, if I'm understanding movement as a question of the body, of a certain kind of physical relationship, or a sense of bodily capacity, a somatic question, if I'm following movement in that way. And I mean, I think certainly, we know very well how ideas about the unheard, about what is held in the body, about those inaudible, often termed a notion of like repressed silences, are very much articulating themselves through movement, giving a certain somatic registration that are often, of course, unconscious or undirected, right? Involuntary or semi-voluntary. So I think the body as a carrier of the inaudible is very much expressing that through movement most of the time. And I think even on that level, we might think about voice even as movement. Because I think probably for sure what Lacan would really invite us to appreciate is how the thing is expressing itself through the body, right? Through things we say, through things we do, without necessarily knowing that we're doing that, right? So the thing is very much behind expressivities of the body. And I think we can definitely carry that into a more social idea of the body, the collective body, the sort of social life of things are often also expressed through types of movement that also might not be fully conscious, or might in a way allow for certain kinds of monstrosities. They can also be very beautiful things as well. And I think that's really this line about when listening helps, right? So the idea that listening is really actually there as what allows us to approach the thing, right? To approach the really real, by listening inwardly, through the ideas of negative listening, for example. These are all, in a way, proposed as methodologies for not necessarily becoming conscious of those things that we're often carrying, but at least to attune to them in ways that are sensitizing us to appreciating their presence, right? And so all those things that are seemingly missing, that are seemingly inaudible, that are seemingly silent, but are really at the center, I think listening is the very thing that can help us as a capacity for partnering, right, with the thing. So in terms of movement, I mean, one of the things that has been very present in something called the Listening Academy, which is a project that I'm running, the Listening Academy, which is a ongoing series of workshops around listening that brings people together, is often a very strong presence of the somatic. There's a very strong interest in somatic practices, body work, and the ways in which listening is really connected to those practices, and in fact are listening practices in themselves, that I think often are very much connected to questions of healing, questions of repair, questions of living with what the body carries. So not necessarily overcoming them, arriving at that moment in which suddenly we feel that everything's fine, but more finding ways of living with. And I think listening is really there as a very powerful, transformative capacity for doing that. Yeah. I hope that, gave you some thoughts. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.